We increasingly hear more and more voices stating with greater regularity that the NATO military alliance led by the United States is on its last legs. Precisely because deep down, Donald Trump no longer believes in it as an organization that guarantees U.S. national security. On the contrary, with a rearmed Europe pushing confrontation with Russia, the risk of entering a war could, like never before, threaten the beautiful continental territory of the United States. The British magazine New Statesman, in a recent article titled, "NATO is on the brink. Can the Western Alliance survive Trump's new era?" revisits NATO's history in detail and argues that a rapprochement between the U.S. and Russia may lead to the transatlantic military alliance's demise, though in reality, these predictions might not come to pass. Don't go anywhere, stay with us until the end, because what you're about to hear could change the way you see global power dynamics. We'll give you the details you need to truly understand what's going on and help you stay one step ahead. This is Quick News, where we break it all down to promote critical understanding of current events. On January 7, 2025, before taking office as president, Donald Trump said, "I believe NATO countries should spend 5% of their GDP. All NATO countries are capable and should spend 5%, not just 2%, declared the magnate, sending a clear warning to the rest of the alliance's members. Once in office, Trump made it clear that mending relations with Russia is more of a priority for him as U.S. Commander-in-Chief than commercial and military ties with Europe, something we've already covered in a previous video. For the United States, national security is paramount. They cannot allow any NATO country to go to war with Russia, since Russia possesses the highest number of nuclear warheads in the world, plus hypersonic missiles that no defense system can stop. In the event of a NATO-Russia war, Putin could unleash his nuclear arsenal to strike American soil. Because the United States is the hegemon supporting all 32 NATO member states, Trump sees this dangerous possibility clearly. That's why improving relations with Russia is a national security priority. And part of that process involves putting an end to the bloodshed in Ukraine. We must remember the dispute between Zelensky and Trump in the White House, along with Vice President Ivins, after which the U.S. paused military aid and stopped sharing intelligence data with Ukraine, leaving the country practically defenseless against Russian air and missile strikes. European leaders rushed to ease the tensions, including the UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who doesn't have a good relationship with Trump, mainly because during the US presidential campaign, this bland and inexperienced British politician openly supported Biden and Harris. Now Starmer avoids openly criticizing Trump while trying to build a European coalition to strengthen and support Ukraine, something that, without US involvement, seems like a fantasy. French President Emmanuel Macron recently said, at the beginning of March, "We want to believe that the US will remain on our side, but we must be prepared in case it doesn't." Macron even suggested opening a debate in Europe about the possibility of officially protecting European allies under the French nuclear deterrent umbrella, something that sounds like a joke, given that France only has about 290 nuclear warheads and still depends on US intelligence data. Following Macron's proposal, an extraordinary meeting of the European Council was held in Brussels. There, Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission's proposals for Europe's rearmament program were approved, an initiative expected to mobilize nearly 800 billion euros for the continent's security and defense. But how far can these European rearmament ambitions really go? To understand the present, let's review some impactful historical data. Pay attention, because here's where the video gets really interesting. Although the NATO military alliance was founded 76 years ago, in 1949, it actually originated as a Western European initiative based on the 1948 Treaty of Brussels between the UK, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Let's remember, it took the Nazis just 44 days to seize French territory. The Belgians surrendered in 18 days. The Dutch gave up in just 5 days. They were already under German boots. And Luxembourg was taken in just 1 day. The United Kingdom resisted the invasion only because it's an island protected by the sea, and for Germany taking London was much more complicated. After the war, the fear of another invasion by a military power led these 5 nations to join forces in that treaty, which included a mutual defense clause among its signatories, an automatic collective response in case of aggression against any of its members on European soil. This was the precedent of NATO's now famous Article 5 on collective defense. 1 year later in 1949, Anglo-Saxon intelligence services had abundant information suggesting that the Soviets would soon possess nuclear weapons. This was considered a threat, especially by the 5 signatories of the Brussels Treaty. That's when European countries turned to the United States for military security and nuclear deterrence, essentially setting in motion NATO's creation, which became official in April 1949. As Anglo intelligence services had suspected, just half a year after NATO's founding, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. This heated up the already looming Cold War, triggering a high-stakes arms race that would soon include a space race. Let's pause here and clarify a few things. NATO propagandists claim that the alliance was born out of the Russian nuclear threat, but that's not entirely true. NATO was formed first, and only months later did the Russians successfully complete their nuclear tests. In fact, it was the Anglo powers who first threatened the Russians. Let's not forget, World War II hadn't even ended when the Anglo allies of the Soviet Union, namely the UK and the US, were already planning Operation Unthinkable to invade Russia. In other words, those so-called allies were plotting to attack the very nation that had suffered the most in the war against Nazi Germany, the country that had effectively defeated Hitler and taken Berlin. Interactive question. Do you think NATO's eastward expansion provoked Russia, or was Moscow always a threat regardless of NATO's actions? Give us your opinion in the comment box below. Search Operation Unthinkable on Google and you'll see that the Russians were not the aggressors at the end of World War II. By 1945, the Soviet Union had lost over 27 million people in the war and was left in ruins. Yet the Anglo powers wanted to exploit that weakened state to crush the Reds completely, and then they turn around and claim Russia was the aggressor. In short, in 1945, the Anglo powers wanted to invade the war-torn Soviet Union, and by 1949, they created a military alliance supposedly to stop a nation that was still devastated and rebuilding. Today, there are 32 nations surrounding Russia with U.S. military bases and nuclear and non-nuclear missiles aimed at Moscow, yet they keep parroting that Russia is the aggressive one. Had NATO not pushed to surround Russia with American military bases, the war in Ukraine might never have started, but NATO and its propagandists kept insisting that Ukraine would be integrated into the alliance, and this is the result. NATO's main strategy to avoid a direct confrontation with the Soviets was always based on deterrence. A conventional war between the Soviet Union and NATO would have instantly escalated into a global nuclear conflict. That's why the United States deployed nuclear weapons in Europe, what's known as the American nuclear umbrella, to serve as a deterrent in case Russia attempted an invasion. But would the Russians really be foolish enough to try invading Europe, knowing they'd be hit with nuclear weapons in return? I don't know. You tell us in the comments below. Since NATO's creation in 1949, Europe has been content with the security guarantees provided by the United States. Although the UK and France developed their own nuclear forces during the 1950s and 60s, these arsenals were, and still are, largely insignificant in shaping global military balance. That balance is ultimately determined by the United States and Russia. Having trouble understanding that? Well, it's the reality. Europe's military dependence on the US is so extreme that even the United Kingdom relies on American missile launch systems to deploy its nuclear weapons. France's nuclear strike force is more self-reliant, but even then, it still depends on NATO support, especially early warning systems run by the Americans. This deep dependency was more than enough for European allies to agree from the start that Uncle Sam should have strategic military control over the old continent. Today, Germany hosts more U.S. troops than any other NATO country. Around 35,000 American soldiers are permanently stationed there. That makes Germany a prime nuclear target. This traditional division of labor, nuclear weapons supplied by the United States, frontline troops provided by Europe, seemed acceptable throughout the Cold War and even until recently. But Donald Trump has sounded all the alarms across the European Union. Let's not forget that in the 1990s, defending Europe no longer seemed urgently necessary. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and many of its former satellite states joined not just the European Union, but also NATO. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with Poland, a former Warsaw Pact member, quickly joined both the EU and NATO. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, once close Soviet allies, also became part of the Western Bloc. Meanwhile, Russia, left in ruins after the USSR's fall, could do little to prevent NATO from surrounding it with military bases, that is, until Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000. In the early 2000s, Putin used every diplomatic channel to build bridges with the West, but the United States needed an enemy, someone to justify Europe's continued spending on American-made weapons. Peace isn't profitable for the warlords who light the match and sell the bullets. That's another truth few dare to accept. During the Cold War, NATO allies, excluding the United States, typically spent over 3% of GDP on defense. But by the mid-1990s, after the Soviet collapse, defense spending plummeted, dropping to just 1.6% in 1995. That downward trend continued until Trump came to power in 2017, demanding that all NATO members increase their military budgets. NATO countries eventually committed to spending at least 2% of GDP on defense, but even that took time. In 2014, only 3 members met that threshold. By 2024, 23 out of 32 members had reached it. Still, on January 7, 2025, Trump raised the bar again, saying 2% was not enough and pushing for 5% of GDP to be spent on defense. This shift means one thing: more weapons bought from the U.S., the true winner in Europe's rearmament race. The United States is Europe's warlord, the one selling the bullets and the security guarantees. In 2021, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen created the European Defence Fund, which many saw as a power grab by Brussels. The 800 billion euros recently promised by Ursula for Europe's military buildup could theoretically reduce dependence on the US, but that's a long-term process, and even then, success is uncertain. Meanwhile, Trump's new era is being described by some as the beginning of NATO's end. Though others argue that's premature, since the United States is unlikely to officially leave NATO before Trump's term ends, and a new Democrat could arrive in 2029 who is friendlier and more aligned with Europe. Despite the rhetoric, Europe is racing to free itself from America's nuclear umbrella. But beyond the speeches, it's unlikely they'll make any meaningful progress before the end of the decade. Political historian David Reynolds reminds us that 4 of NATO's 12 founding members were Canada, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark, which includes Greenland, a territory now reportedly eyed by Donald Trump for its strategic Arctic location. The former Soviet Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, joined NATO in 2004, along with Nordic nations Finland and Sweden, which entered in 2023 and 2024 respectively. They now form a formidable defensive arc against Russia's Arctic flank. Russia, for its part, roams that territory freely with its nuclear-powered icebreakers. According to Reynolds, these Nordic NATO members share vital security and trade interests that should keep them united. But reality reminds us that all NATO members ultimately rely on U.S. nuclear guarantees, a situation that's nearly impossible to reverse in the short term and extremely difficult in the medium term. France has offered to act as Europe's new nuclear umbrella. But most serious military analysts dismiss that idea outright. France simply cannot compete as a global deterrent. So Uncle Sam still matters in Europe, Reynolds asserts. Let's not forget that Ursula von der Leyen and many European leaders are pushing for Ukraine to join the EU quickly. But according to a recent study by the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, this would cost the EU far more than its entire annual budget, possibly leading to economic collapse. That study estimates Ukraine's accession would cost over 2.247 trillion euros, almost 13 times the EU's entire 2025 budget. If all 27 EU countries are expected to chip in and help Ukraine reach European living standards, there won't be enough money left to build a NATO independent of the United States. So Ursula, where on earth are you going to get the money? Even if the EU were to confiscate the 200 billion euros in frozen Russian reserves, it still wouldn't be enough. Therefore, the US will keep pushing Europe to buy more American weapons, but with a strong warning. Don't go picking a fight with Russia. Bark all you want, but don't bite the bear. Because if a real war breaks out, the US will walk away from NATO. As if all this weren't enough, recent reports suggest Ursula is promoting a union preparedness strategy, urging European households to stock up on basic supplies, water, and medicine for at least 72 hours in case of war, pandemics, climate disasters, or cyber attacks. Well, look at what Europe is becoming, led by a German bureaucrat. In the end, it's all a show. Trump pressuring Europe to spend more on US weapons, while European leaders posture and pretend to be united against Russia. But this isn't about peace. It's about war. A virtual hug to all of you. And until next time, dear friends, we hope you stayed until the end, because the historical facts in this video are essential to understanding today's global conflict and how deeply Europe relies on the United States for its security. The transatlantic military alliance known as NATO has long relied on the United States as its strategic backbone, especially regarding nuclear deterrence. Since the Cold War, the U.S. nuclear umbrella has been Europe's safeguard against a Soviet or Russian offensive, turning countries like Germany into the front line of any potential conflict. While France and the UK possess their own nuclear arsenals, they remain insufficient to replace U.S. capabilities. The election of Donald Trump, who has demanded increased military spending from European allies and hinted at withdrawing U.S. support, has reignited fears about Europe's dependence on American power. The beneficiaries of this situation are clear: the U.S. arms industry, which profits immensely from increased European military budgets. Meanwhile, the potential losers are European taxpayers, who now face demands for massive defense spending, while also absorbing the economic burden of Ukraine's EU integration. Despite efforts to build a more autonomous European defense, analysts agree that breaking away from the U.S. nuclear umbrella is nearly impossible in the short term. As the geopolitical chessboard shifts, Europe stands at a crossroads between sovereignty and continued reliance on a superpower that increasingly treats alliances as business transactions. Now it's your turn. If you found this analysis revealing, leave us a comment with your opinion on NATO's future. Can Europe really break free from U.S. military dependence, or is it trapped under Washington's shadow? Subscribe if you haven't already, because we'll be following the evolution of this story minute by minute. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next video, where we'll explore France's potential role as Europe's nuclear guarantor. And if you want to understand how NATO expanded into Eastern Europe after the Cold War, click on the video on screen. You won't believe what's been uncovered.